Manchester United History Part 1. The Railway Men. There are places in the world, modest and unremarkable at first glance, where history decides to begin. A carriage shed in Newton Heath, in the east of Manchester, was one such place. It stood in the shadow of the Lancashire and Yorkshire Railway's locomotive works, a vast, clattering complex of iron and steam, where men arrived before dawn and left after dark, their hands blackened, their backs bent by labour, their lives shaped entirely by the rhythm of the railways. In 1878, some of those men picked up a football. What followed, across the next 147 years, would become one of the most extraordinary stories in the history of sport, but in 1878, none of that mattered. What mattered was the game. To understand Newton Heath, Lancashire and Yorkshire Railway Football Club, you must first understand the world that made it. The Manchester of the 1870s was a city of relentless industry and unsparing toil. It was, by almost any measure, one of the great engines of human civilization in that age. Its mills and factories had transformed the world, not just Britain but the world, in ways that generations living through the transformation could barely comprehend. Raw cotton arrived from the plantations of America and Egypt and left Manchester as finished cloth that dressed the populations of continents. The railway network radiated outward from the city like arteries from a beating heart, carrying goods and people and ideas in volumes that would have seemed impossible to a man alive only 50 years earlier. Manchester was rich. Parts of it were extraordinarily rich. Grand civic buildings rose along the principal streets, temples to commerce and municipal ambition that announced to the world that this city knew its own worth. But the Manchester of the mills and the railways was also a city of profound inequality. The men who fed the machines, who stoked the furnaces, operated the looms, laid the track, and maintained the rolling stock, lived lives far removed from the grandeur of the civic centre. Their streets were narrow and their houses small. Their working hours were long, their leisure hours few, and their expectations of comfort modest by any standard but their own. The cotton mills had made Manchester famous, but it was the railways that sustained it, and it was the railways that, in the autumn of 1878, gave English football one of its most consequential gifts. The Lancashire and Yorkshire Railway was one of the great employers of the industrial north. Its network connected the towns and cities of Lancashire and Yorkshire, linking the ports of Liverpool and Hull, threading through the Pennines, serving the mill towns and the market towns and the growing suburban communities that were spreading outward from the great cities. At the heart of the operation, in terms of maintenance and construction, was the company's works at Newton Heath. This was a large and busy complex. Men came from across East Manchester to work here, from the streets of Newton Heath itself, from Bradford and Beswick and Miles Platting, from the expanding terraces of working class housing that were spreading across the eastern districts of the city. They were, in the main, craftsmen. The carriage and wagon department, where the club was born, employed joiners who fitted the wooden frames of the carriages, painters who applied the distinctive liveries, metal workers who shaped and fitted the ironwork, and labourers who moved materials and cleaned and assisted wherever they were needed. It was hard work, it was skilled work, and it was work that forged a particular kind of community, one based on shared labour, shared hardship, and a shared understanding of what it meant to depend on the man beside you. That community, in the late 1870s, was looking for something to do on a Saturday afternoon. The precise moment at which Newton Heath, Lancashire and Yorkshire Railway Football Club came into existence is one of those questions that historians and supporters have argued over for generations. The records from those earliest years are incomplete. The club was not founded with ceremonies or constitutions or minutes of meetings carefully filed for posterity. It grew, as working men's clubs generally grew in this period, through conversation, through shared enthusiasm, through someone suggesting that it might be worth having a go, and someone else agreeing, and a third man saying he knew a patch of ground that might serve the purpose. What the evidence suggests is that the club was established around 1878. The men of the carriage and wagon department were its founders and its first players. The captain and principal organiser in those earliest years was a man named E. Thomas, known in the records simply by that initial and surname, as so many figures from this era are reduced to a first gesture and a last name. Thomas, by all accounts, was the kind of man that any nascent football club requires: organised, persuasive, and genuinely committed to the project. He arranged the fixtures, he rallied the players, he ensured that when Saturday came, 11 men in green and gold were ready to take the field. Without men like Thomas, most clubs of this kind dissolved within a season or two. Newton Heath survived, and survival in those early years was the first and most important achievement. The colours, green and gold, deserve a moment's reflection. They were, in the first instance, simply the colours of the Lancashire and Yorkshire Railway. The company used green and gold in its livery, and the football club, as an extension of the company's workforce, adopted them without particular ceremony. There was no great deliberation, no committee decision, no competition to choose a badge or a design. The men wore what they were given, or what was available, in colours that announced their affiliation. But those colours would acquire, over the following decades, a meaning far beyond their practical origin. They would become the colours of resistance, of loyalty, of a particular kind of identity that could not be bought or sold or rebranded by corporate decision. In the 21st century, when those colours returned to the streets of Manchester in protest at the ownership of the club, they carried with them the full weight of history. The history that began, invisibly and without intention, in the carriage sheds of the Lancashire and Yorkshire Railway in 1878. The men who chose the colours had no idea what they were creating. They simply put on their shirts and played. The football of the late 1870s was a game in rapid evolution. The Football Association had been established in 1863, and its codification of the rules had given the game a common framework. But that framework was still settling. The laws governing how the goalkeeper could use his hands, specifically the restriction of handling to within the penalty area, would not be formalised in their modern form until the 1890s. The offside rule had gone through multiple iterations since the 1863 code, and arguments about its application were a regular feature of matches at every level. The shape of teams, the tactical formations that players adopted on the field, was still being discovered through practice rather than theory. Most clubs played with a single goalkeeper, a pair of backs, and 8 or 9 attacking players spread across the field. The idea of a disciplined midfield line, of structured defensive organisation, of positional play in the modern sense, was still decades away. Football was, in this period, a game of individual endeavour within a loose collective framework. The player who could dribble, who could take the ball, beat his man, and create an opportunity was the player most valued. Passing, as a planned tactic, was an innovation still gaining acceptance. The Scottish game had developed a passing style earlier than the English, and the influence of Scottish players moving south, particularly after professionalism was legalised in 1885, would begin to change the character of the English game. But in the Newton Heath of 1878 and 1879, these were not yet live debates. The men from the carriage and wagon department were learning to play the game as it was played around them, with enthusiasm, with physicality, and with a determination to win that is the common currency of all working men's football in every age. Their opponents in those first years were the other teams of the Manchester area. Works clubs were the most common adversary, the teams formed by the men of other factories, other yards, other railway depots. Church teams were another staple of the fixture list. Victorian England was full of football clubs formed under the auspices of local churches, an aspect of the muscular Christianity movement that saw sport as a path to both physical and moral improvement. School old boys clubs, local associations, and the occasional travelling team from a neighbouring town rounded out the early fixture lists. These were informal arrangements. The match was agreed between the respective secretaries by letter. Kick-off time was settled. The ground was prepared as well as resources allowed. And then the game was played, the result recorded, and the two sides returned to their respective concerns. What stands out, in retrospect, is the sheer volume of football being played across England in this period. Thousands of clubs, at every level from the grandest professional outfit to the humblest works team, were engaged in the game. Football was becoming the national obsession. It was spreading down every street and into every community. And Newton Heath, however modest their origins, were part of that great spreading. The ground at North Road became the club's home as the early 1880s arrived. It was situated in Monsall Street, and it was, by the standards of the period, a workmanlike facility. The pitch itself was problematic in wet weather. Manchester, positioned at the foot of the Pennines and exposed to the prevailing southwesterly winds, receives its share of rain. North Road, in autumn and winter, could become a heavy, clinging surface that tested the stamina of players and the patience of spectators in equal measure. There was minimal cover from the elements. The changing arrangements were primitive. Players might travel to the ground already changed, or use a nearby public house for the purpose, but North Road was theirs. It was the ground where Newton Heath developed their identity, where their early supporters gathered, and where the traditions that would eventually pass transformed almost beyond recognition to Old Trafford and beyond were first laid down. The supporters who stood at North Road in the 1880s were not a large crowd. For most fixtures in this period, a few hundred people would have been a good attendance, but they were genuine, they were local, they were the neighbours and workmates of the men on the pitch. When Newton Heath won, they felt the victory. When Newton Heath lost, they carried the defeat home with them through the same streets. The relationship between a football club and its community is never more direct, never more unmediated than in those earliest years. There was just the ground and the game and the people who came to watch it. As the decade progressed, Newton Heath began to change in composition. The strict connection between the club and the Lancashire and Yorkshire Railway's carriage and wagon department began to relax. Players from elsewhere in the railway company found their way into the team. Men who were not railway workers at all began to appear. This was a natural evolution. The club had grown beyond the capacity of a single department to supply all its players. The standard of football in the Manchester area was rising, and to compete, Newton Heath needed the best available players rather than simply the best available railway workers. There was, attached to this evolution, a quiet but significant shift in the club's identity. It had begun as an expression of a particular workplace community. It was becoming something different. A football club in its own right, connected to the railway company by its name and its history, but no longer defined by it. This process would continue over the following decade, and its completion would bring both liberation and crisis. But in the mid-1880s, it was simply a matter of finding the best 11 men available for Saturday. The year 1885 brought a change to the broader landscape of the game that would eventually reshape Newton Heath's place within it. The Football Association formally legalised professionalism. Paying players for their services had been happening informally for years. The great clubs of Lancashire and the Midlands had been recruiting talented players from Scotland and elsewhere with financial inducements that went well beyond mere expenses. The legalisation of professionalism did not instantly transform Newton Heath. The club did not suddenly find the resources to pay a roster of professional players. But it changed the environment in which they were operating. It meant that the clubs who could afford to pay professionals would pull ahead. It meant that the gap between the well-resourced clubs and the rest would widen. And it meant that Newton Heath, if they were serious about competing at the highest level, would eventually need to confront the question of their own financial model. That question, in its various forms, would recur throughout the history of this club. In 1888, the landscape of English football was transformed by a single meeting. William McGregor of Aston Villa Football Club had written to 5 other clubs with a proposal. He envisaged a regular competition, fixed in advance, played home and away, with a clear table of results that would give the leading clubs a reliable programme of matches and a reliable source of income. The response exceeded his expectations. On the 22nd of March 1888, representatives of 12 clubs met at Anderson's Hotel in Fleet Street, London. They agreed to form the Football League. The founding 12 were Accrington, Aston Villa, Blackburn Rovers, Bolton Wanderers, Burnley, Derby County, Everton, Notts County, Preston North End, Stoke, West Bromwich Albion, and Wolverhampton Wanderers. Newton Heath was not among them. Newton Heath was not at that moment among the dozen clubs with the largest grounds, the most established professional arrangements, or the most significant supporter bases. They were a serious club with genuine ambitions, but they were not yet at the table. The answer came in the same year. The combination, a competition intended to occupy the clubs who had not been invited to join the Football League, offered Newton Heath their first taste of organised, structured competition. The combination brought together a varied group of clubs from the North and the Midlands. Newton Heath entered the 1888 to 89 season with purpose. This was not a works team playing Saturday afternoon friendlies. This was a football club playing competitive matches in an organised competition with a table and a season's narrative and the possibility of finishing above or below their rivals. The standard was demanding. The experience was invaluable, but the combination as a competition proved unstable. Clubs withdrew from matches when it suited them. The organisation was uncertain and contested. By the end of that single season, the combination had effectively broken down. Newton Heath needed somewhere else to play. The Football Alliance, formed in 1889, gave them that somewhere. The Alliance was an ambitious project. Its founders were motivated, in part, by frustration with the Football League's closed-shop approach, its unwillingness to expand membership, and its protection of the financial interests of its founding clubs. The Alliance offered an alternative. It was properly organised, with fixtures agreed in advance, a clear table, and a genuine competitive structure, and it attracted genuine clubs. Nottingham Forest, one of the oldest and most respected clubs in the country, were members. Small Heath, who would eventually become Birmingham City Football Club, were members. Sunderland, Albion, Grimsby Town, Bootle, Darwen, and Walsall Town Swifts were among the others. This was serious company. These were clubs with established followings, competitive players, and the experience of organised football at a higher level than Newton Heath had yet faced. Newton Heath entered the Football Alliance for the 1889 to 90 season. They were going up in the world. Newton Heath's first Football Alliance season was a formative experience. They finished somewhere in the middle of the table, creditable but unremarkable. The fixtures took them to grounds across the Midlands and the north of England. Away trips of this kind, involving rail travel, overnight stays in unfamiliar towns, and matches in front of crowds who were firmly against them, were a different proposition entirely from the home comforts of North Road. They were also, for a club developing its competitive character, invaluable. A team that can only win at home is not truly a competitive team. Newton Heath, over the course of that first Alliance season, learned to deal with hostility, with unfamiliar pitches, with the pressure of a proper contest. The crowds at North Road were growing. Word was spreading through the communities of East Manchester that the club was worth watching, that it was no longer simply a works team playing informal matches, but a serious football club competing against the best available opposition. In the second Alliance season they improved, putting together a more consistent run of results and demonstrating that they were capable of competing with the stronger clubs in the competition. By the third season, Newton Heath had established themselves in the upper half of the Alliance table, not champions, but no longer newcomers either. They were, by the standards of the Alliance, a respected club. Other sides came to North Road knowing they were in for a serious contest. What the Alliance seasons gave Newton Heath, beyond the results and the table positions, was experience. The experience of travelling to grounds far from Manchester, the experience of playing in front of large crowds with the noise and the pressure that large crowds generate, the experience of managing a season, of maintaining concentration and commitment through the long autumn and winter months, of recovering from defeats and not becoming complacent after victories. These were lessons that a football club can only learn by playing, and Newton Heath, through 3 seasons of Football Alliance competition, was learning them well. There was also, running beneath the surface of those Alliance seasons, a growing awareness of what the club was becoming in relation to the railway company whose name it still carried. The Lancashire and Yorkshire Railway had given the club its identity, its colours, and its first generation of players, but by the early 1890s the connection was loosening. Players were recruited from across the country. The committee included men who had no direct connection to the railway company. The supporters who came to North Road on a Saturday afternoon came because they loved Newton Heath Football Club, not because they worked for the Lancashire and Yorkshire Railway. The club was outgrowing its origin. It was becoming its own thing. The players of this period deserve recognition, even if their individual stories are imperfectly preserved in the historical record. The men who played for Newton Heath in the Football Alliance were professionals or semi-professionals in the technical sense. Some received payment, some did not. Some received a combination of wages and expenses that made the distinction largely theoretical, but they were serious footballers. They had skills and qualities that the best clubs in the country were willing to pay for. And Newton Heath, in recruiting them, was demonstrating an ambition that went beyond the railway depot and the local fixture list. Some came from the Manchester area, young men from the streets around Newton Heath who had grown up kicking a ball and who now found themselves being asked to play in organised, competitive football. Others came from further afield. Scottish players were beginning to make their mark in English football in this period. The legalisation of professionalism in 1885 had opened the door to the kind of organised recruitment that brought talented players south across the border. Newton Heath were not yet a wealthy enough club to attract the finest Scottish talent, which was flowing toward the larger clubs of Lancashire and the Midlands. But they could offer a place in a serious team, a competitive programme of fixtures, and the prospect of playing in front of a growing and enthusiastic crowd. For a young man from Glasgow or Airdrie or Motherwell, that was not nothing. From the northeast of England, too, players were beginning to make the journey. Durham and Tyneside had their own rich football tradition, and Newton Heath's expanding network of contacts drew on it. The diversity of origins that was beginning to characterise the Newton Heath squad, Manchester men, Scots, Northeasterners, players from the Midlands, was a reflection of the broader transformation of English football in this period. The game was becoming national, it was becoming professional, and it was creating, for the first time, a market in footballing talent that stretched across the entire country. The answer arrived in the summer of 1892. The Football League, having observed the Football Alliance's growing strength, decided to act. Rather than allow a rival competition to develop into a genuine threat, the Football League invited the best clubs from the Alliance to join an expanded version of the Football League. The expansion would create a new second division, a tier below the established first division, offering the new arrivals a place in the league structure, but not an immediate place alongside its most powerful clubs. 16 clubs were offered membership. Newton Heath, Lancashire and Yorkshire Railway Football Club was among them. The invitation was accepted. And with that acceptance, a chapter in the club's history closed, and a far longer and more complicated one began. It is worth dwelling for a moment on what this invitation meant. To be included in the 16 clubs chosen for Football League membership was a statement of recognition. It said, "You are a serious club. You have demonstrated over the course of 3 Football Alliance seasons that you can organise, compete and attract a following. You are ready for the next level." For the committee men who had kept Newton Heath alive through all the years since 1878, who had argued about fixtures and counted gate receipts and written letters requesting away matches and worried about the state of the pitch and the size of the wage bill, the invitation to join the Football League must have felt like vindication. All of it had been worthwhile. All the muddy Saturday afternoons at North Road, all the journeys to away grounds that took most of a day to reach by train, all the matches played in biting cold or driving rain in front of crowds that ranged from the respectably sized to the barely handful. All of it had been building toward this. Newton Heath were going to the Football League, and nothing would ever be quite the same again. The 14 years from 1878 to 1892 were, by any objective measure, modest years. No trophies, no famous victories, no players whose names became legends, no crowds of tens of thousands, no national newspaper coverage, no moments that would be remembered beyond the local community, just football. Just a group of working men and then a growing community of football people building something from the ground up. But those 14 years were not merely a prelude, they were the foundation. The values that sustained Newton Heath in those early years, the commitment to hard work, the refusal to give up, the pride in representing a community, the belief that the club was worth fighting for, regardless of the immediate circumstances, those values did not disappear when the club joined the Football League. They persisted. They ran through the history of the club like a vein of iron through stone. They were there in the great years and in the terrible years. They were there when the club was nearly lost to bankruptcy, and they were there when it stood at the summit of European football. They were, and remain, what the club is. The men who built Newton Heath in those 14 formative years were not famous, they were not wealthy, they were not powerful. They were working men, men whose labour built the Victorian age, whose hands shaped the railway network, whose contributions to English life are measured not in monuments but in miles of track and years of toil. And in the time left to them, in the evenings and on Saturdays, in the muddy fields and modest grounds of industrial Manchester, they built something else, something that would outlast them all, something that would grow beyond any imagining they might have attempted into one of the most recognised and celebrated institutions in the world. They did not know that. They could not have known it. They just knew the game. They just knew the club. And they believed in it. The green and gold of the Lancashire and Yorkshire Railway would not endure. Change was coming, not only to the colours, but to the name, the ground, the identity, and the entire sense of what this club was and what it might become. The Football League awaited. And in the Football League, for the first time, Newton Heath would stand alongside the most powerful football clubs in England. Some of those clubs had resources that dwarfed anything available at North Road. Some of them had been professional for years, had built grounds capable of holding tens of thousands, had established the commercial structures that made a football club financially sustainable in the modern age. Newton Heath had a muddy pitch, a basic ground, fragile finances, and a name so long it barely fitted on a match programme. What they also had, what they had always had from the day the first men from the carriage and wagon department laced up their boots and took the field, was a spirit that could not be bought or borrowed or manufactured. It was the spirit of a club that had built itself from nothing, the spirit of men who refused to accept that where they had come from determined where they were going. In 1892, the rest of English football was about to find out what that spirit was made of. The railway men had built their club. Now the real test was about to begin. In the next episode, we follow Newton Heath into the Football League, the struggle of those first seasons in the second division, the battles against relegation, the severing of the last formal ties to the Lancashire and Yorkshire Railway, and the gradual, sometimes painful process of becoming a club capable of standing on its own. The railway workers were becoming simply footballers, and the long, turbulent, magnificent story of Manchester United was just beginning to find its shape.